Welcome to FemLead, the podcast on female leadership and role models. Prepare to feel inspired and better equipped to navigate your career path. I am Alexandra Chabotaru, your host, and together with my guests, we will tackle a new field of work in each episode. The aim of this podcast is to deep dive into career perspectives and strategies to navigate your desired path for success. Enjoy! Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode. Today we discuss neuroscience and entrepreneurship. My next guest is completing a Ph.D. in neuroimaging. Her current research focuses on neuroscience and entrepreneurship. This is a collaboration between the Entrepreneurship Institute and Neuroimaging Department at King's College London, aiming to uncover if there is something different in the brain of those who think entrepreneurially. The questions she will address in her research are: how do entrepreneurs' cognition differ to non-entrepreneurs? Do these differences in cognition correlate with the individual's experience and differences in brain structure? And can interventions develop this cognition? Super interesting. I'm very excited. Today we welcome Emily Clements as our guest. Hello, Emily. It's really great to have you join us.
Hi, great to be here.
Let's start from the beginning, Emily. What is neuroscience?
So neuroscience is the science that deals with the structure and the function of the nervous system. So specifically, the stream that I'm interested in is cognitive neuroscience. And what this is the kind of processes within the brain that underlie cognition. And cognition is the way that we take in, process, store, recover, and use information. It's essentially how we think.
That's very interesting. I listen to different podcasts on neuroscience, and I'm always fascinated by the correlation between how we think and how we make decisions. And the fact that you decided to focus your research on neuroscience and entrepreneurship and create a bridge between it, I think it's really, really interesting. So can you tell us a bit more about what is your research focused on specifically?
Yeah, so the title Neuroscience of Entrepreneurship is obviously very vast. It could cover a lot of things. So when I kind of spoke about cognition, what I'm really interested in is the cognition kind of behind entrepreneurs. So how they think, how they process information. We generally know entrepreneurs are good outside the box thinkers. We know they're able to persevere in kind of quite uncertain and maybe quite difficult environments. But I guess from a neuroscience perspective, I'm interested in what this looks like in the brain and whether it can be trained.
And based on your research so far, so just to put some context, you haven't published yet the research, but we will discuss about some of the findings that you have to share from the research. So that is really amazing that we're doing this here in the podcast. And I was thinking, can you start by sharing some clear findings, like really base foundational findings from your research about neuroscience and entrepreneurship, the good stuff and the not so good stuff, maybe?
So I guess really when we're looking at the cognition of entrepreneurs, so actually I'll start off with the fact that if you were going to study entrepreneurship, it's so vast and there's so many different things that you could study, that for me it was about focusing in on my interest, which happened to be cognition and how people think. And then kind of the way I processed and thought about it is I need to start splitting this out into, but what different ways do entrepreneurs need to think? So, obviously they need to be creative. They need to come up with ideas. That's kind of the seed and the starting point. But then there's also other areas they need to cover, like being able to validate these ideas and implement them and take action. So the kind of research that you can look at is, as I said, vast, but it includes lots of things from what creativity looks like in the brain to how people make decisions and the different ways in which you can make decisions. So whether you take a kind of intuitive approach to your decision making or an analytical approach. And one particular kind of area of research and findings that I think are really interesting are some neuroscientists who have looked into the difference between exploration and exploitation. So exploration is when you kind of try a new way of doing things. So you don't exploit methods that have, previously you've used and that they work. You just explore, you try a new way of doing something. And by kind of using games and cognitive tasks, they looked at the difference between these two styles and what happens in the brain when people make decisions in this way. And they essentially showed that in exploring and this kind of decision making that actually does underlie innovation, there's a lot of cognitive control processes, and the area of your brain that's involved in kind of attention and really directing your attention becomes very engaged, which to me is very interesting, because quite often when you think of creativity, you think very intuitive, you think very unconscious, you think of people just being born with this ability to have these insights. But actually, if you look at the science behind kind of how people drive a change or drive something different or try a new strategy, it's very analytical in nature, and it requires your brain to be analytical in nature, which I think is perhaps one of the most interesting insights that neuroscience can add, is that actually insights, innovation, and creativity really do require a balance between perhaps that very intuitive thinking that gives you the idea, but actually the very kind of analytical process of validating this and carrying it forward into something that for entrepreneurs becomes a business.
Very, very interesting. I was curious if you have any insights on the entrepreneurial mind and teamwork, if there is any connection to, I don't know, a successful endeavor, if you have help, or if you share responsibility, or if you find your place and you're really sticking to that, or whether you become more of a generalist. Is there any correlation between that?
I'd say absolutely. There's definitely findings that show diversity and diversity of thought is very important. And if we take this approach of, let's say, going back to looking at the different ways in people think and the different types of cognition, you often hear that some people are the kind of ideas people and some people are the really good people at being analytical and implementing that. And I think this kind of idea can come across really well in a team, that you can see that if you can match people who have these kind of slightly different, I mean, whether you think of it as a personality, whether you think of it as a cognition and a thinking style, if you can kind of match people who have these different elements, you can create a team that together is able to, really come up with good ideas and really drive that forward. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and it's definitely, every time I kind of end up, writing and thinking about it, I always come back to that, because I think, when we're thinking about, in my case, studying entrepreneurship with the eventual aim for that to kind of inform the education and training around it, do we want to say one person can do it all and train that in one person? Or actually, might we end up in a place where we say, actually, maybe one person can't do it all? So you can evaluate where that person is and match them with people who will complement them and help them.
The dream team. I really love this idea of people coming together and having the same aim, but also recognizing their strengths and recognizing their weaknesses and saying, I'm just not the best person at analyzing data. Also, maybe my interest is not to analyze data. So I'm not going to be that person, and I'm going to let somebody else do that part of the job. So I feel that there is also some maturity there to, decision making, like you've mentioned, or to role distribution. And on that note, something that you've mentioned just a few moments ago was about some findings on decision making. Is there anything that influences decision making when we look at the way we think? Like, is there something that we should be aware of that maybe is not a well-known fact?
So I'd start by speaking about, this kind of self-awareness is essentially what we call metacognition. Meta meaning on top of. So it's kind of like the on top of your cognition. So cognition about cognition, which becomes a bit inception-y. But it's essentially that self-awareness about how you think. And I'd say that entrepreneurs particularly have to really develop this self-awareness and this metacognition. When you're working in a very difficult, uncertain environment, you need to start evaluating, how do you usually make decisions? What are your habits? What do you kind of intuitively go to? And is that the right thing to do? Because there will be cases where actually following intuition probably is the right thing to do. But then there's also going to be cases where you really need to think whether the strategies that you usually go to are the right ones.
I would be curious also to continue on. I wondered if I should ask you this, but of course I'm super curious, so I will ask you, and let's see if there's anything that you want to share. Is there any difference between men and women when it comes to taking risks? Do you have any thoughts on that, or any?
So yeah, I'm just laughing to myself because it's yeah, I mean, so I think I have kind of two answers to this. So I think we need to stop searching for biological differences between the sexes. The research on it is political and it's flawed, and it kind of really steps onto this nature nurture debate, because if you start asking, are men more risk taking than women, and are they innately so, for me it's kind of the wrong question to ask, because as researchers, as entrepreneurs, as people in society, we should really think about what value our research brings. And to me, searching for a biological reason why kind of one sex might succeed than the other is not going to bring value. We need to just look at someone, regardless of who they are, what the skills that they have are, and what we can nurture and we can create from that. And yes, people will have different predispositions, and whether you believe that this is biological or this is cultural, or whatever you believe, people will have different predispositions that might make them behave in a different way. But to me, really, behavior is nurtured and it's learned. If you think of habits, if you think of everything, we learn to behave in that way. So I kind of stray away from really talking about whether there are these differences between men and women, often because I kind of think it's the wrong question to ask. And my second answer is kind of on the risk-taking, which is I don't think entrepreneurship is so much about taking risks. Really, yes, maybe for some people financial risks, but a lot of actually the process of entrepreneurship and what people do when they are looking to create a business is they are trying to reduce the risks as much as possible. When people do market research, when they do customer surveys, everything that people do in this process is reducing the risk. They're gathering information. So I think that, I think, it's kind of more about the skills that you can teach people to do and how you can evaluate where someone is. And to me, the solution is kind of, how do you change the environment and how do you cultivate entrepreneurship in someone, regardless of where they start. I don't know if that really kind of answers the question. I kind of swayed away from the question.
I love it, and I'm quite surprised that you say that in such a straightforward way, because I never thought about it as why should we ever differentiate between men and women when we have so much discrepancies on different fields. And of course, one of the reasons why I started this podcast was to showcase female role models instead of everybody, because we of course have a lot of incredible men out there that do amazing work, but I prefer to focus on showcasing the women around us that are role models. And I think it's extremely interesting that you've mentioned that, because I would be curious to just ask you, what do you think we should tell ourselves, or what do you tell people who want to make this differentiation in questions and data and numbers, so that they showcase the discrepancy between A or B, and they can use this to their advantage by sharing, look, this is not really equal, so let's try to make it more equal for the, of course, greater good. So everything we're discussing here, it's about helping a part that maybe has been discredited or not giving the same chances from the beginning. And this can be on many different levels, not only men and women, but it can be about many different topics. How should we look at this then? What should we focus on, and how do you change a whole society that focuses on this biological differentiation, knowing that this will not really help us necessarily on the long run? Like, it will just increase the gap if we look at it only like this. So what should we do?
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point. Obviously, it's good to gain the data to show where discrepancies are. And perhaps, so the data that we should try and gain, and the research we should be doing, is looking at, the amount of investment that female entrepreneurs get, the opportunities they get. Where are the discrepancies in society? How are young girls kind of spoken to when they're children? Are they told to be, oh, careful, watch what you're doing? Well, boys are encouraged to be kind of fearless and bold. It's what we kind of should look is actually about researching the environment that we are creating and how that is kind of adding to this gender stereotyping, rather than saying, let's look from birth at if there are differences between men and women. I personally just don't really see the point. You really have to ask yourself, and I guess people need to ask themselves doing the research, what's your purpose? What's the purpose in researching what you are doing? What do you want the outcome to be? If you want the outcome to be to help people and to nurture people to kind of build their skills, so and for example in entrepreneurship, then research how these skills are built and research how you can cultivate this. The starting point doesn't matter too much. That's the baseline. Everyone is their own control. So no matter what your starting point is, you can grow and you can learn and you can cultivate different skills and behavior. But yeah, I think it's just about knowing the purpose behind the questions that we ask, really, particularly as researchers. I think it's really important.
What an interesting point, and I'm very happy that you tackled this so directly and straightforward with what you stand for, because one of my next question was, what would you advise women if they are, for example, not sure about their capabilities? So we can basically scratch that, and we can answer the question, what do you advise anybody who has doubts about starting a business based on the research that on skills of entrepreneurial people? Because you just said that it's not about taking risks, it's about minimizing risks. So what is it then that makes us entrepreneurial, and why then are people afraid to start building their own businesses if they have ideas?
No, it's a really interesting question. I think that is the key point, isn't it? What differentiates people who have ideas to people who take action? Some people might say it's risk. Maybe it's a kind of fear of uncertainty. Maybe sometimes it's confidence. I think one thing's for clear, that you see people tend to be more entrepreneurial or more confident in being an entrepreneur if they've been in an environment that they see other people doing it. So, for example, I can say personally, before kind of starting doing this research, I never considered myself to be entrepreneurial, or I never thought I would want to start a business. But as part of my job, I spent a day every week at the Entrepreneurship Institute at King's, and I was constantly around. Like, everyone there is entrepreneurial. They're all, you know, creating startups or helping people do so, or you've got kind of mentors and coaches and experts there who are constantly just kind of, you know, spreading their wisdom. And when you go and get a coffee, the conversations that happen are so inspiring and so kind of evolved around people who really do create this action from their ideas. That I kind of now, about 2 years later, see myself like, I could start a business. Like, why not? Like, if they can do it, I can do it. Like, everyone can try. So yeah, I guess my advice would be to think about the environment that you're in. If you feel like you don't have the skills or the capabilities or the confidence, try and reach out and network with people who are doing what you want to do. You know, we're such social creatures. We learn from those kind of immediately around us. And I think things like accelerators and things that kind of home in and promote these entrepreneurial skills in these spaces that these people can work together are really successful in kind of, yeah, I guess helping people realize their potential.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about role models, which I love because it's very much key to why I'm doing this project. And I think that definitely the environment you're in really influences your perspective. How prone are you to start maybe new projects just to try them out when everybody around you has a side hustle and they are really happy with trying things out outside of their working hours, for example? And do you have any advice or any research on what are the stages of decision making? What does our brain go through when we decide to move forward with a situation versus another situation? Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what I guess want to research in a way. So when I spoke earlier about your kind of intuitive decision making, so the intuition for everyone is going to be different because it is based on your past experiences. So if you're in your past experience watch Netflix every night, your kind of intuitive thing when it gets to a certain time in the evening might be to watch Netflix. So I guess you know, what's kind of happening in your brain is not a lot, really. So our brains like to kind of use as little energy as is needed. So if something doesn't require a lot of effort, it's going to try and not use a lot of effort. So your kind of habitual and your intuitive response is going to be to do what you've done in the past. I guess it kind of comes into a little bit about habit change and how you change habits. And it does require practice and it does require effort. So I mean, one thing I will say is, you know, if you want to break habits that you don't view as a kind of, you know, good and productive for you, is it takes effort and time, and you can't expect kind of like an easy way out. You do just need to practice. You need to practice having a bit more structure and things like that. On the other side, I also want to note that it's really important that people have downtime and that they're not trying to go at 100% all the time. I read something so interesting recently that was resilience is just as much about how you rest and recover. And I think it's really true. You can't be resilient if you are always trying to go at 100%. You really need that time to just have some downtime and not think so much and disengage. And I just think it aids you to be kind of more creative, more productive. And when you really do want to do that analytical thinking and that really hard stuff, you can, because you've given your brain time to rest too. So I'd say the kind of, obviously, yeah, the decision making, the way it kind of goes is you will be most inclined to go towards your intuitive response, and you can override that with a kind of more effortful, you know, the first step is noticing your habits, noticing what you're doing. The second step and the harder step is to start changing that. And just habit and practice, just really kind of like implementing something in if you want it to change, but not being too hard on yourself. And yeah, I think allowing yourself the downtime as well is important.
Does it take 21 days to break a habit? Or is that just something that circulates on the internet?
Yeah, I don't know how long it takes. And I think it changes for different people. But I think you can create and change habits very quickly if you're structured with it. I know myself, you know, things when it comes to exercise. If I just for 1 week, you know, make sure I don't know if I've ever done exercise every morning, but you know, if you just maybe we'll say 4 times a week, if I start going to the gym in the morning, like so quickly I then want to do that, and it's like you want to wake up and the first thing I want to do is exercise, which is not maybe where I am at the moment. But it kind of does show you how if you first of all kind of engage in that effortful process to make yourself do something, eventually you want to do it. But then I think there's got to be a little bit of motivation behind it anyway. You can't form a habit and make yourself do something that you really don't want to, which is why it's important to, you know, do something you're passionate about. And for entrepreneurs, definitely to create a business or venture in something that they're passionate about, because you can't drive yourself and put all those hours in if you don't really care.
For sure. And you also mentioned rest, and I will ask you, just so I have you on record, how important is rest for our well functioning? Because it is important for our brain, it is important to rest for our well-being, but how important it is and why we should really sleep.
Why we should sleep. Everyone should read the book Why We Sleep. I mean, so many reasons. You know, throughout the day when your brain is working, it is just constantly using the energy that you provide it with your food and just churning this out. But at the same time, it's also churning out waste products and, you know, things that are not so good for your brain. When you're in a really high stress environment, you have a stress response in your body, which is the release of cortisol, which is stress hormone, which has real kind of like downstream effects on the cells in your body that are just not beneficial at all and actually quite damaging. And it you know, that is science. It's kind of hardcore science that not sleeping and stress are really bad for your health. You know, they're linked to so many kind of long-term health implications later in life as well. And I just think it is so important. I think people forget that. They think I'm young, I'm invincible. It's all about the hustle. Like I'm just going to go at 100% all the time. And it quite often takes most people to burn out until they realize that they've gone too hard. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people then don't learn until then. And you can kind of try and have awareness beforehand, though, that, you know, all this go and all this kind of stress and hard work is eventually going to have really detrimental effects to your brain and your mental health. And kind of, I guess, the strategy of tackling it before it becomes a problem is really good. So allowing that downtime, allowing that rest, doing things that you enjoy or you find relaxing, definitely sleeping is really important.
And when it comes to entrepreneurship and well-being, like linked to your research, do you have any learnings about how the two topics intersect? Is there anything that, you know, on top of what you just shared now, any learnings, any new ideas that you want to share?
Yeah, so I think when I spoke about kind of entrepreneurial environments being this kind of quite extreme, this very uncertain, volatile environment, this really creates an environment that things like burnout and anxiety and other mental health disorders are really going to come into play. You know, when we think about what anxiety is, a lot of the time it is this kind of overthinking about the unknown. It's worrying about all the possible scenarios that could happen, and quite often the worst case scenario. And if you think about the kind of process that entrepreneurs have to go through, that kind of thinking is quite important in a business setting, to be able to plan for the worst and think of all the scenarios and have a strategy that you will implement. But you can imagine that if that's what they're doing in their work life, it's also going to seep into just how someone thinks. They're going to perhaps be someone who might be more prone to this kind of overthinking and worrying and trying to gain a sense of control by thinking, if I can predict and plan out every possible scenario of something that could happen, then I have control over it, which you don't. And I think particularly the kind of moment we're living in at the moment with COVID-19 and with the pandemic, sorry to mention it, but it shows us kind of how kind of our behavior does change when something is really uncertain. I'm sure most people, particularly at the beginning, were just hooked to the news, hooked to their phone, that needing information, because you think, if I can get all this information, if I can kind of predict what's going to happen, in some ways I can control it. And you create this kind of cycle and loop in your brain where you convince yourself that by engaging in that behavior, and then, okay, you plan for scenario A, B, and C happens, you've somehow controlled that, which you haven't. You kind of, in some cases, you have no control. But I think, what it kind of really brings us back to is, how do we think and how do we overthink and how do we kind of control that thinking? And it's tough. And I think entrepreneurs probably do really suffer with these kind of, this anxiety, the burnout that we spoke about from all these kind of like stressful mechanisms. But it doesn't mean that we can't kind of do things to intervene with that. So, for example, going back to talking about mentors and advisors, if you can create a really good support network around you, then you can kind of control these anxieties. You can have advice and opinions from different people. You can quite often kind of counteract that overthinking and balance it out by perhaps having a advisor or mentor who is someone who is a bit more, I don't know, rational in their thinking. And I just think that, these are the kind of insights that I'd love to gain from my research, which is, if we can look at the different ways that people think, and then actually the implications that this has on their well-being, can we create environments and teams that actually slightly counteract this, or nurture people, or provide a kind of supportive group that will help them counteract the challenges that they might face.
I'm very happy that you mentioned also mentorship, because one of the topics that I wanted to tackle was the impact of receiving advice and having mentors to the setup that you create for yourself when you are an entrepreneur. And like you said, it's really important to have a support system. So you shouldn't really think you need to be alone or you need to take those decisions alone, but rather create that group of people that supports you, even if it's with a decision or just an advice, or with actually creating an entire analysis with you on how should this move forward. It can be something really really simple, or it can be something more complex. I would be really curious if you could sum up for our listeners, if they are to take one key idea from our interview on entrepreneurship and neuroscience of entrepreneurship, what should they take? What is that one idea that people should, leave this interview with?
I'd say probably the key thing is just to firstly kind of develop a self-awareness about who you are, how you think. Sometimes this kind of delving into yourself can be quite difficult and often has to be pointed out by other people. But I think the first step, obviously, gaining that self-awareness. And then kind of secondly, as we've spoken about a lot, is knowing kind of your limits on what you can do. So you probably have many strengths in many different ways, but everybody has their limits. And I think it's about recognizing where those limits are for you and where perhaps you can better resource them in someone else, whether that be, you know, if you're building a business, whether you want to employ people to do those jobs, when we speak about advisors and mentors, whether you want them to kind of fill that gap for you. But I think a lot of time people don't spend enough time thinking about kind of who they are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. Perhaps maybe their strengths, maybe not always weaknesses. And I think, yeah, kind of from the neuroscience, from kind of just my own advice, and not even in entrepreneurs, just in everyone, I think you can be a lot more successful in your career if you just start to recognize who you are and how you think. And yeah, and I guess it doesn't mean you can't develop other skills and think in a different way. I definitely think you can. But I think a kind of more personalized approach to entrepreneurship is what is needed, not just a generalized, you know, as Steve Jobs giving a quote on how he was successful. It helped him, but it might not help other people. So I think a personalized approach to who you are, how you think, and kind of what success is to you is the kind of most important thing to consider along the way.
Note that down and start working on it. That's what I can say about it. I really love it. And I think it's really inspiring to hear that, you know, from your research, what boils down to is who you are as a person as the key to moving forward, because we often mirror, you know, other people's perceptions on, you know, how should we be successful? What is success to me? But we don't sit down to have this introspection and say, okay, but what is it that I really want? Who am I really? What are some of the things I really want to do versus what I thought I want to do? So I'm very happy that you've mentioned it, because I think for some people it will really be revealing, and maybe they will do this exercise for themselves to, you know, find out who they are and what they really want to build. I want to move into your career for the last few minutes, because I'm really interested in finding out how did you get here studying neuroimaging, neuroscience, and what inspired you to follow this path?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in science, so I was always going to do that. I ended up doing an undergraduate degree. I started in biomedical science, but I ended up just picking all neuroscience modules. And I think my tutor was like, why don't you just switch to neuroscience? That's clearly what you're interested in. So when I say kind of follow your interest, it really is how I kind of didn't really have a plan or know, but it just streamed into neuroscience. And I think it's because, you know, at the heart of it, I do really want to know how people think and how people behave. And studying the brain is a great way to do that. But I mean, interesting enough, what really inspired me to end up in kind of neuroimaging and where I am now was during, I think it might have even been my first year. I remember this man coming and giving a talk about MRI and cognition, and how these MRI scanners could see inside the brain and show you what people are thinking, and it's the future of science. And he was so compelling, and I just remember sitting there and thinking, oh wow, I'd love to do that. That would be really cool. But kind of it's funny, because when I think I kind of thought about that with an element of doubt. I remember thinking, oh, that'd be really cool to do, but not really thinking I'd end up actually doing it. And funnily enough, that man who came and gave that talk is now my boss, Steve Williams, who's head of the neuroimaging department at King's College. So, and I kind of forgot that situation happened. And then one day I just remembered, I was like, oh yeah, hold up. Quite a while ago, I thought that's what I wanted to do. And here I am. And it was kind of that moment of realization that I'd kind of ended up doing, yeah, perhaps maybe like my dream job, really. And particularly with the entrepreneurship spin, because I really, once I started studying it, wanted to combine it with business. And this PhD and this job is just literally the dream for me, because it has kind of all my interests merged into one.
That sounds really great. I'm very happy that you also share more about the way it came together, because I do want to have this message shared that, you might not know from the beginning of your university what you will specialize in or how your life will look like, but there's a lot of opportunities for you to discover. So it's definitely super interesting that you've decided to go into STEM, knowing that you want to study science, and then you found out neuroscience as, core to what you like. And I would be curious to know, what was the best piece of advice that you received so far in your professional journey?
So I hope she doesn't mind me quoting her, but so one of my another boss I have is Julie Devonshire, who's from the Entrepreneurial Institute, and she once told me, just keep doing what you're doing until someone tells you can't. And I loved it, because it's kind of, I think so often we're so paralyzed about what to do and doing the right thing. And particularly when you're kind of early in your career, you don't want to step on people's toes. You want to be always kind of polite and respectful. And I think it is important to do that, but also you can't spend too much time worrying, like just do things. And if you do it wrong, someone will tell you. And you've got to be open to that criticism, and you've got to be willing to learn from your failures, as they always speak about in entrepreneurship. But I think I just quite often think about it, and I just think it's a good piece of advice. Just do what you're doing until someone tells you that you can't, or you're not allowed, like within reason, within the law. But
I love it. I'm very curious to ask, what is the most rewarding activity of being a neuroscientist? The MRI scans, or
I think the most rewarding thing is that people are at the center of it. You're studying people, you're getting to work with people, you're getting an insight into how people think. And although I kind of do it as a job, I find myself kind of applying a lot of the way I think about it to everything. When I speak about this kind of self-evaluation, thinking about how you behave, thinking about how others behave, I think it kind of helps you build a lot of empathy and understanding towards people's behaviors. You can understand that, their quirks might be just a product of their experience. And I think, humans are just fascinating. We're always learning and we're always growing, and it's our brains that are doing this. So I think that's probably the most rewarding thing about it, is just kind of having this insight into how we all behave.
Very interesting. Emily, you've been very kind with us. You've shared a lot of learnings, and you've shared part of your research. So thank you so much for doing so before the research is actually out. We will be following your journey to actually share the research once it's published. I do want to sum up on a more serious note about what is your stance, or maybe even piece of advice, for bringing more women to STEM. So the STEM field: science, technology, engineering, and math.
I mean, yeah, we need more women, particularly at, I'd say there's a lot of women who are entering STEM. And I think there's a lot of really good programs out there that have promoted this and driven this. But I do think, unfortunately, it's still kind of at the lower levels, at the kind of lower grade jobs in academia, the kind of, I think majority of research assistants are women, and then majority of professors are men. So it hasn't yet filtered up to the kind of the higher levels. I think perhaps where the work needs to happen is programs that actually work on not the entry into STEM, because I think that's been achieved quite well. I think it needs to be, okay, now you're in there, how do you build yourself up, and how do you kind of persevere and stay in that environment to work your way up?
A very, very good point. And also, from the inside, you seeing that, you probably noticed that you have more male professors, and this is something that, of course, once you look for role models, you maybe think about, okay, where are all the female role models? Where are, how do we make that more, representative of also assistants and people who get into STEM? So thanks a lot for sharing your view on that. I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this interview. I'm sure it will be a delight also for our listeners. Thank you, Emily. It has been a pleasure to converse with you. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for more updates from female role models. I hope you felt inspired to take charge of your next career move. Remember to review this podcast and share your comments. Thank you.